When the darkness came for her, the following days unfolded with a deceptive calm that made Elena Whitmore almost believe the worst had passed. The hospital board's investigation neared its conclusion, and unofficial whispers suggested her full exoneration was imminent. Patients continued requesting her by name, colleagues greeted her more warmly again, and even the administration's tone had softened. Yet beneath that fragile return to normalcy, an invisible tension lingered, one Elena could not explain, but Adrian felt with growing certainty. The night after their conversation in her apartment, he had doubled the unseen protection around her building, placing loyal nocturnal sentinels in the surrounding shadows. He did not inform her. He knew she valued independence, and he refused to make her feel watched. But Morgana's faction was no longer operating with subtlety. Her patience had eroded into ruthless calculation. If the human girl would not be driven away by shame, then fear, and if necessary, danger, would sever the bond. It happened on a storm-heavy evening when Elena finished a late double shift. Snow mixed with freezing rain, turning the streets slick and nearly deserted. She declined a taxi to save money and began walking home, clutching her coat tightly against the wind. Halfway through a narrow side street, the power grid flickered, streetlights dimmed. The air itself felt heavier, colder than winter should allow. Elena slowed, sensing movement behind her. At first, she assumed it was paranoia born from exhaustion, but then she heard footsteps that did not echo like human ones. They were too silent, too synchronized. When she turned, 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes reflecting faint crimson beneath the failing lights. Instinct, not knowledge, told her they were not human. Fear seized her body, but she refused to freeze. She backed away slowly, her voice steady despite her racing pulse, asking what they wanted. The tallest figure stepped forward, smiling with predatory calm, telling her she had captured the attention of someone far beyond her place, and that such attention came with consequences. Before Elena could react, the shadows around them twisted violently. A gust of supernatural force swept the alley, extinguishing the remaining lights. Adrian Valerius materialized between them with regal stillness. His presence so commanding the lesser vampires recoiled instinctively. His eyes glowed not with rage, but with sovereign authority, the gaze of a king defending what was his to protect. He spoke only once, his voice low yet absolute, ordering them to leave and report back to their mistress. The command was not shouted, yet it carried power none of them could defy. Within seconds, they vanished into the storm, retreating like smoke before fire. Elena stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. Adrian turned toward her slowly, the supernatural aura around him fading just enough to soften his appearance. He asked if she was hurt, his concern immediate and genuine. Her fear was not directed at him, but at the realization that his world was far more dangerous than she had imagined. She whispered the question she had been too polite to ask before. What exactly he was? Adrian did not lie. He explained calmly that he was not human, that he ruled a hidden society existing parallel to hers. He expected fear, distance, perhaps rejection. Instead, Elena surprised him. Though shaken, she focused first on the fact that he had come to protect her without hesitation. She admitted she did not understand his world, but she understood actions, and his actions had always been kind. The queen chosen by kindness. The final decision from the hospital board arrived on a pale winter morning, delivered in a sealed envelope that trembled slightly in Elena Whitmore's hands. She stood alone in the staff corridor before opening it, her breath shallow, heart braced for either relief or devastation. As her eyes moved across the printed words, emotion flooded her chest, so suddenly she had to steady herself against the wall. The investigation had concluded fully in her favor. All accusations were dismissed, her record formally cleared, and the board issued an apology for the distress caused. Furthermore, several senior physicians had submitted commendations recognizing her extraordinary dedication during the Christmas Eve emergency. Tears filled her eyes, not from pride, but from the release of weeks of silent fear. For so long she had fought quietly, believing no one powerful would stand beside her. Yet unknown to the hospital, the influence that protected her had been far greater than institutional support. That evening, Adrian Valerius requested she meet him at the snow-covered overlook where they had spoken before. When Elena arrived, she found not just him, but an atmosphere charged with gravity. His posture was regal, his dark coat stirring in the winter wind, his expression composed, yet carrying the weight of a decision centuries in the making. He congratulated her first, his voice warm with genuine admiration, telling her that truth had prevailed because she had never compromised her integrity. Elena thanked him, not just for his words, but for standing beside her when she felt most alone. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was anticipatory, as though the world itself held its breath. Before either could speak further, the air shifted violently. Shadows gathered unnaturally across the overlook, forming a circle that cut off escape. Morgana Duskgrin stepped forward from the darkness, her presence elegant yet venomous. She no longer hid her hostility. She declared openly that immortal had no place beside the vampire king, that Elena's existence threatened the stability of the nocturnal throne. Adrian moved instinctively in front of Elena, his protective stance absolute. Morgana offered him a final ultimatum: abandon the human girl or watch her be erased from the world he ruled. What she did not anticipate was Adrian's response. His voice, when he spoke, carried the full authority of a sovereign who had ruled through centuries of war and betrayal. He declared that strength without compassion was tyranny, and that Elena's humanity had reminded him what true leadership required. Morgana attempted to strike, summoning shadow-bound power toward Elena, but Adrian intercepted it effortlessly, his aura igniting with royal force. The confrontation was brief, but decisive. Loyal members of the Nocturne Court, already summoned in secrecy by Adrian, emerged from the darkness and restrained Morgana before her attack could continue. Her betrayal, both political and personal, was exposed before witnesses. She was stripped of rank and exiled from the court she had once sought to control. When the shadows receded, silence returned to the overlook, broken only by the soft fall of snow. Elena stood shaken but unharmed, her mind still processing the supernatural conflict she had witnessed. Adrian turned to her, not as a distant king, but as a man choosing vulnerability over power. He confessed that centuries of immortality had numbed him to connection, that he had ruled through fear and duty alone. But her kindness, her refusal to abandon compassion even when humiliated, accused, or endangered, had awakened something he believed long dead within him. He did not speak of possession or destiny. He spoke of respect, of partnership, of wanting her beside him not as a subject, but as an equal. Elena's answer came not through grand declaration, but through quiet courage. She admitted she feared his world, its dangers, its darkness, but she did not fear him, because every time power had been placed in his hands concerning her, he had chosen protection over control. She agreed to stand beside him, not as someone transformed by power, but as someone who would remind him why compassion mattered. Weeks later, whispers spread through both worlds of a historic change. The vampire king had chosen a human consort, not for bloodline or politics, but for her soul. Elena continued her nursing work, refusing to abandon the calling that defined her. Adrian supported that decision, ensuring hospitals across the region received anonymous funding and protection. Together, they bridged two worlds, one eternal, one fragile, proving that respect and kindness could command more loyalty than fear ever could. And in the end, the shy nurse who once walked hospital halls unnoticed became the queen who changed a kingdom, not through power, but through compassion that even immortality could not extinguish. The accusation that shattered her Christmas morning arrived over Blackthorn Hollow not with warmth, but with the pale, fragile sunlight that barely pierced the winter clouds. Elena Whitmore had not slept. After leaving the cafe the previous night, Adrian had personally driven her back to the hospital through the heavy snow, his presence calm and protective in a way that lingered in her thoughts long after he left. She had finished the remainder of her shift with renewed strength, replaying his words in her mind whenever exhaustion crept in. For the first time in years, someone had seen her sacrifices instead of her shortcomings. That fragile happiness, however, lasted only until she was summoned to the administrative wing just before noon. The message had been brief and formal, requesting her immediate presence in Chief Nursing Officer Margaret Hale's office. Elena assumed it was routine, perhaps recognition for the patient she had saved. She walked in with nervous humility, hands clasped, posture small. But the air inside the office felt cold, heavy, accusatory. Margaret sat behind her desk with a printed document laid flat before her. Her usually composed expression tightened with concern. Without preamble, she slid the paper forward. It was an anonymous complaint accusing Elena of abandoning her post on Christmas Eve to meet a man, alleging that her distraction had endangered patients and violated hospital ethics. The words blurred as Elena read them, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered under the weight of humiliation. She explained about the cardiac arrest, the life she had fought to save, the overtime she had stayed without complaint. Margaret listened, but policy required investigation, regardless of intent. The hospital's reputation was strict, and anonymous reports could not be ignored. Elena felt as though the ground beneath her had cracked open. Years of tireless work, sleepless nights, emotional losses all reduced to suspicion by a single malicious lie. Outside the office, whispers had already begun spreading among staff. Some nurses looked at her with sympathy, others with quiet judgment. One senior colleague muttered that kindness often hid irresponsibility. The words pierced deeper than they should have. Elena retreated to the locker room, locking herself inside a stall as silent tears fell. She had spent her life trying to be enough, yet it took only one accusation to erase everything she had built. Unbeknownst to her, far above the human city in the obsidian chambers of the Nocturne Court, Adrian Valerius felt the shift instantly. A king attuned to the emotional currents of those he cared for could sense distress like a tremor in the earth. While attending a council meeting he had no desire to sit through, his attention drifted. The elders debated territorial disputes, but Adrian's thoughts were fixed on Elena. He could feel her sorrow sharp, undeserved, unjust. Excusing himself abruptly, he retreated to his private chamber, where shadows obeyed his will. With a single command, information flowed before him through supernatural networks hidden within human systems. The anonymous complaint surfaced quickly, along with the fabricated surveillance claim attached to it. His eyes darkened not with rage, but with something colder, protective resolve. No one harmed someone under his watch without consequence. Meanwhile, Elena forced herself back onto the hospital floor, despite the investigation looming over her. A child in the pediatric ward refused treatment unless she was present. An elderly woman clutched her hand, calling her an angel. Even while her career hung by a thread, Elena continued serving patients with the same quiet devotion. Doctors noticed. Families noticed. The truth of her character radiated in ways no accusation could conceal. Yet fear lingered. If she lost this job, she would lose the only identity she had ever been proud of. That evening, as her shift ended, Elena stepped outside the hospital into the freezing dusk. Emotionally drained, she expected to walk home alone. Instead, a sleek black car waited by the entrance. Adrian stood beside it, tall and composed, as if he had always belonged there. Shock flickered across her face, part relief, part embarrassment at being seen during her lowest moment. He did not ask questions immediately. He simply opened the passenger door and told her she looked exhausted. The gentleness in his tone broke the final wall around her composure. Tears welled in her eyes as she confessed everything: the complaint, the investigation, the fear of losing her career. Adrian listened in silence, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. When she finished, he spoke only one sentence, but it carried the weight of a royal decree. He told her that truth never needed to fear shadows, and that no storm touching her life would go unanswered. Elena did not fully understand what he meant, but for the second time in 2 days, the presence of the mysterious man made her feel safe against forces she could not see. High above the city, Morgana watched surveillance feeds again, satisfied that the first fracture in the nurse's life had begun. She believed humiliation would drive the girl away on its own. What she did not account for was that the Vampire King had already chosen whose side he stood on. Shadows move against the crown. The investigation's momentum began shifting in Elena Whitmore's favor, but relief did not come easily to her heart. Though testimony and footage had weakened the anonymous accusation, the final decision from the hospital board was still pending, leaving her suspended in an agonizing state of uncertainty. She continued working under supervision, her movements quietly monitored, her reputation balanced on a fragile edge. Yet instead of retreating inward, Elena chose to stand taller. She greeted every patient with the same gentleness, stayed beyond her scheduled hours, and never once allowed bitterness to enter her care. Her resilience did not come from pride, but from the simple belief that kindness should never be conditional. Staff who had once been neutral began speaking more openly in her defense. Even Chief Nursing Officer Margaret Hall softened, privately acknowledging that Elena's work ethic spoke louder than any allegation. But while truth slowly gathered strength within the hospital walls, darker forces were assembling beyond them. In the obsidian citadel of the Nocturne Court, tension spread like wildfire. Adrian Valerius had summoned a private council, his presence commanding yet colder than usual. Morgana Duskrin stood among the elders, her expression composed till fury burned beneath her stillness. She had not expected the king to trace the complaint back to her so quickly. Adrian did not accuse her publicly. He was too strategic for that. Instead, he addressed the council about loyalty, about the dangers of underestimating humanity, and about the consequences of acting against the crown's chosen interests. His gaze lingered on Morgana only briefly, but the message was unmistakable. The court murmured uneasily. For centuries, Morgana had been considered the king's most trusted advisor, rumored even to be destined for the throne beside him. The idea that a mortal nurse could disrupt that political certainty unsettled many. Morgana realized then that subtle sabotage would no longer suffice. If the human girl remained close to Adrian, she would always be a threat, not politically, but emotionally. And emotional influence over a king was far more dangerous than any rival faction. Back in the human world, Elena's life outside the hospital remained modest and quiet. She lived in a small apartment above an old bookstore, the walls lined with second-hand novels and medical journals. One snowy evening after her shift, she returned home to find the building's heating system malfunctioning, the corridors freezing. While other tenants complained loudly, Elena organized blankets and helped the elderly residents upstairs stay warm. She brewed tea on a portable stove and delivered it door to door, never mentioning her own exhaustion. It was in that moment Adrian arrived, having come unannounced after sensing her lingering distress. He paused in the hallway, watching silently as she cared for others despite her own struggles. The sight struck him more deeply than any royal ceremony ever had. Power, he realized, did not always wear crowns. It sometimes wore kindness in silence. He revealed himself only after she finished helping the last resident. She was surprised, but smiled warmly, embarrassment flickering as she apologized for her building's condition. Adrian dismissed it entirely. To him, her world, though humble, felt more genuine than the marble halls he ruled. They spoke quietly in her apartment, sharing tea while snow fell outside the window. For the first time, Elena asked about him, not his business titles, but who he was beneath the composure. Adrian chose his words carefully, revealing pieces of truth without exposing the full darkness of his existence. He spoke of long years, heavy responsibilities, and the loneliness of leadership. Elena listened without fear, only empathy. She told him that being needed by others could feel isolating, even when done with love. Their connection deepened not through grand gestures, but through shared vulnerability. Unseen beyond the frost-covered glass, danger watched. Morgana had dispatched lesser vampires loyal to her faction to observe Elena directly. Cloaked in shadow, they studied her routines, her home, her weaknesses. Morgana's patience had ended. If destroying Elena's reputation failed, she would engineer fear instead. She believed that once the mortal girl understood the monstrous world Adrian belonged to, she would run or break. Either outcome served Morgana's purpose. That same night, as Adrian prepared to leave Elena's apartment, a sudden supernatural chill swept through the hallway. His instincts sharpened instantly. He stepped outside to investigate and sensed hostile presence retreating into darkness. Though brief, the message was clear. Elena was no longer safe simply because she was near him. The war Morgana had begun in secrecy was escalating into direct threat. Adrian returned inside, his expression composed, but his voice carrying new gravity. He told Elena the king steps into her in his world that would not settle heavily over Blackthorn Hollow, and that from the kind of deep winter darkness he would ensure her protection personally. Elena did not fully grasp what he meant in the passenger seat, but she trusted the sincerity in his eyes. Her hands folded tightly in the snow-covered night as streetlights Adrian understood something irreversible had begun. This was no longer about curiosity or admiration. Sharply with the storm. The moment danger reached her doorstep, she had never been the type to confide easily. Yet somehow, in less than 24 hours, she had revealed her deepest fears to a man she barely knew. Adrian drove in composed silence, his posture relaxed but his senses alert. He could hear the uneven rhythm of her heartbeat, the quiet tremor in her breathing, and it stirred something fiercely protective inside him. For centuries, he had ruled kingdoms, commanded armies of the night, and watched empires collapse without feeling personal urgency. But this human girl's pain unsettled him in a way that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. When the car stopped, Elena realized he had not taken her home, but instead to a quiet overlook above the snow-covered town, where the hospital lights glowed faintly in the distance like a fragile constellation. She looked at him, confused but calm, and Adrian finally spoke. He told her that injustice thrived in silence, and that she had spent too long accepting blame that was never hers. His voice was steady, not commanding but reassuring, like someone offering strength rather than imposing it. Elena admitted that she was afraid, not just of losing her job, but of being publicly humiliated. She had seen it happen to others. Once accused, people rarely listened to explanations. Adrian turned slightly toward her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that made her breath catch. He told her that fear was natural, but surrender was a choice, and he did not believe she was someone meant to surrender. The words were simple, yet they carried a conviction that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. For a moment, silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was grounding. The following morning, the hospital board initiated formal review proceedings. Elena was asked to provide written testimony and await further evaluation. Rumors spread faster than facts. A few staff members defended her fiercely, recounting her dedication, while others remained cautious, unwilling to oppose administration. As Elena walked the corridor, she could feel eyes on her, some kind, some doubtful. She focused only on her duties, refusing to let bitterness infect her compassion. In the pediatric wing, she comforted a frightened child scheduled for surgery, reading him holiday stories until he fell asleep. Downstairs, she stayed past shift hours to help an overworked colleague stabilize a trauma patient. Even under investigation, she continued giving more than she was required to. And though she did not realize it, witnesses were quietly taking notice. Doctors, families, and even security staff who had seen her rushing between wards on Christmas Eve. Unseen by human eyes, Adrian had already stepped into action. Using both corporate influence in the human world and the vast intelligence network of the Nocturne Court, he ordered a complete trace on the complaint. Surveillance timestamps were reviewed, internal communications scanned, and hospital security footage accessed through silent supernatural intrusion. Within hours, inconsistencies surfaced. The timeline in the accusation did not match Elena's logged emergency response. Even more telling, an encrypted routing signature on the anonymous email led far beyond human systems into a private, digital relay owned by Morgana Duskrin. Adrian's expression darkened, not with explosive anger, but with cold disappointment. Betrayal from enemies was expected. Betrayal from trusted advisors was something far more dangerous. That evening, Adrian attended the hospital in person, under the guise of a benefactor reviewing charitable partnerships. His arrival caused immediate attention. Administrators rushed to greet him, recognizing his influence and wealth. Elena, unaware of his presence, was assisting a recovering patient when she was called unexpectedly to the administrative floor again. Anxiety twisted in her chest as she entered the conference room, but instead of interrogation, she found Adrian seated calmly beside the hospital board. Their eyes met, and shock washed over her. He gave no revealing gesture, only a reassuring calm that steadied her nerves instantly. The board began reviewing the case, presenting testimony from staff who had witnessed Elena's emergency intervention. Security footage confirmed her continuous presence in the ward during the time she was accused of negligence. The anonymous complaint was labeled unsubstantiated, pending final review. Elena felt her lungs fill with breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for days. It was not complete exoneration yet, but the tide had shifted. When the meeting adjourned, Adrian approached her privately. He did not boast about his involvement. He simply told her that truth had a way of finding light when good people refused to hide from it. From across the city, Morgana observed the failed sabotage with rising fury. She had underestimated two things: the nurse's integrity and the king's willingness to defend her openly. What began as quiet interference was now becoming something far more dangerous, a personal conflict with the throne itself. Snow descended over the old town of Blackthorn Hollow in slow, whispering sheets, covering the streets in a silver silence that felt almost sacred. Inside St. Aurelius Medical Center, however, there was nothing peaceful about the night. Machines beeped in sharp rhythms, nurses rushed between rooms, and the scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Elena Whitmore moved through the chaos like a fragile flame refusing to go out. Her white nurse uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hair escaping its bun in tired strands, and her eyes carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who gave more of herself than she ever kept. She had been preparing to leave for her Christmas Eve shift break, the one night she had promised herself she would be brave enough to meet the mysterious man she had been exchanging letters with when an emergency call shattered those plans. An elderly patient had gone into cardiac arrest, and without hesitation Elena ran back into the ward, her shyness dissolving into fierce focus. Her hands pressed against the man's chest in steady compressions, her voice calm yet trembling underneath as she called for medication and oxygen levels. Minutes stretched like hours, sweat forming along her brow, until finally the monitor flickered back to life with a fragile but undeniable heartbeat. Relief flooded the room, but Elena barely felt it. When she glanced at the wall clock, her heart dropped. It had been over an hour. Across town, inside a dimly lit cafe known as the Velvet Ember, a man sat alone near the frost-covered window. He had arrived exactly on time, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that seemed tailored from shadow itself. His name was Adrian Valerius, the Vampire King, ruler of the hidden nocturnal realm that existed beside the human world unseen. Yet tonight he looked less like a monarch and more like a patient statue carved from marble. A cup of coffee sat untouched before him, long gone cold. The waitress had asked twice if he wished to leave, assuming he had been stood up. Adrian only gave a slight shake of his head. To a being who had lived for centuries, 1 hour meant nothing. What mattered was the girl he was waiting for, the shy nurse whose letters carried compassion, so pure it had stirred something long buried inside his immortal heart. He could sense her somewhere in the city, her pulse racing, her soul burning with urgency, and instead of irritation, he felt admiration. The cafe door finally burst open with a rush of icy wind. Elena stumbled inside, cheeks flushed from the cold, breath uneven from running. She still wore her nurse scrubs beneath her coat, too rushed to change. Her wide eyes scanned the room anxiously until they landed on him. For a moment, she froze. He did not look like the man from a simple profile. He looked regal, ancient, commanding, as if the shadows themselves bowed to him. Embarrassment flooded her face as she hurried forward, apologizing breathlessly, explaining the emergency, the patient, the chaos. Her voice trembled, expecting disappointment. Instead, Adrian stood slowly and pulled out her chair with quiet grace. He told her there was nothing to forgive, that saving a life would always matter more than arriving on time. His voice was deep, calm, impossibly gentle for someone whose presence radiated such power. The sincerity in his words struck Elena harder than any criticism ever had. They spoke softly at first, like two strangers afraid to disturb something delicate forming between them. Elena confessed how often she felt invisible, how people overlooked her kindness as weakness. Adrian listened without interruption, his piercing gaze filled not with judgment, but respect. He spoke carefully of responsibility, of carrying burdens others never saw. Though he hid his true nature, his words carried the weight of centuries. For the first time in years, Elena felt understood. The cafe lights dimmed further as snow thickened outside, sealing them in a quiet world of their own. Yet far beyond the warmth of that table, danger was already awakening. In a glass tower across the city, Morgana Duscreen Adrian's ancient advisor watched surveillance reports of her king's movements. Seeing him spend Christmas Eve with a mortal nurse ignited cold fury within her. To her, humans were fleeting, insignificant. She began crafting a plan not to confront the king, but to destroy the girl quietly. As Elena and Adrian shared their first fragile laughter, Morgana sent an anonymous complaint to the hospital board, accusing Nurse Elena Whitmore of negligence during her shift out. By the time the night ended, Elena believed she had found unexpected kindness in a powerful stranger. She did not know that loving the attention of a king meant stepping into a war she could not yet see.